I like to look at the metric in several dimensions, and that is, what is the impact? Meaning, can I draw a line between that and the business outcome of some kind? Second is the severity. Like, if this changes a little bit, what is the leverage? Like, if this changes a bit, like, is that a big deal or is it like, yeah, right? Uh, which you have those. And then what is also interesting is the difficulty of measurement. Not that that would necessarily drive your decision whether to measure it or not, but with the we are measuring it and we shouldn't, you very often see relatively easy to measure metrics. And that is a little bit of a red flag that tells you maybe we are only measuring it because we can, not because we should.
So for this card, we're going to jump into the topic of metrics. One of the things that people love to hate, just like meetings, just like priorities, people love to hate them.
Yeah.
They're essential, they're necessary, but really we'd wished we didn't have to have them. But anyway, they're really, really important. So metrics, what do we mean by metrics? So metrics are things that we decide we need to count because they are going to tell us something about how our business is operating. Now, humans are notoriously bad at actually coming up with good metrics, and I think that is one of the reasons why this has come up as a card in this series. So,
Yeah.
Milan, tell me what your thoughts are around metrics, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what we should be talking about today.
Well, let me say a few things about this particular card first. So first of all, it's a spade, right? And spades are really about strategy systems. How to get the machine running in the right direction. The machine being the company or the organization, of course. And as many cards, this one was just inspired by something somebody said, and in this particular case that somebody was you. I don't remember the context, but I think it was a webinar, and you said those three key questions that the organization needs to be asking itself when deciding what to measure and why. So I'll throw it back to you. Like, what are those questions, and why do you think, and how did you come up with that concept?
Yeah, well, this concept came to me after running a series of annual planning sessions where I was noticing a pattern that people weren't entirely happy with the metrics that they had come up with, either at a recent kickoff or the kickoff a year or so before. And I was putting it back on them and saying, well, look, these are your metrics. If they're not right, you need to make them right, because these are things that you should be owning as a leadership team. And they sort of got that, but that really didn't give them the information or the knowledge they needed to actually make them better. And there's nothing worse than measuring a metric that shouldn't be measured, because it just demoralizes that and devalues the concept of metrics.
Oh my goodness,
So
absolutely.
yeah. So I guess I took a bit of a step back, and I sort of asked the question. So what? Let's come up with a list of the things that you should be measuring. So I gave them all a sticky note and said, write down the things that you should be measuring, and don't worry if you got the same thing as other people. If we've got 5 cards saying the same thing, well, that's just validating we probably should be measuring that thing, whatever it is. So we got all those sticky notes down, and we put them up on the wall, and we sort of we put duplicates together so we could see that there was shared alignment there. And then I asked the next question: which of these can you measure? So I went round, and if something could be measured, I put a little green sticky on it. And if something could be measured but it was difficult or it took a long time, I put an amber sticky on it. And there were some metrics that they should be measuring that they just couldn't. So, okay, fine. Well, let's put a red sticky note on that, because that's something that we want to come back to. And so I probed a little bit deeper, and I said, so you should be measuring this, but you can't. What's the impact of not being able to measure that? And in some cases, because I did this across a few different leadership teams over that season of annual planning, in some cases, the impact of that was pretty significant. They were missing out on the ability to make much better, faster decisions because they couldn't. And so the next question I asked, which isn't the third question, I'll come to that in a moment, was, how long have you not been able to measure that, and how long have you known that you should be measuring it? And in some cases, they'd known about this for about a year or more, even from before when we'd first started. So how we missed it first time round, well, that's on me. I'll take that one. But I guess the realization for the leadership team was, okay, this is serious. If we can't measure it now, we need to find a way to measure it accurately, reliably, consistently, and we need to do that soon. So now that was probably a candidate for a Q1 priority for those companies. So the last question is, once we know what we should be measuring and once we know what we can measure, the third question in that suite is, what do we measure? And the pattern I noticed was that, it became like a three-circle Venn diagram. And what we want is a three-circle Venn diagram where you can only see one circle. Now, this Venn diagram was not like that. There were things that they should be measuring that they couldn't. There were things that they did measure that they shouldn't. Obviously, you can't measure something that you can't measure, but there were significant numbers of things that people could not measure that they should be measuring. So that got a lot of insight, because it suddenly meant that we were throwing away a whole load of metrics that people didn't need to count, but we'd also identified some significant, interesting, valuable metrics that they needed to go out and find a way to measure accurately, consistently, reliably.
Yeah.
So that's where it came from. And I use those questions pretty much in every annual planning session and probably in most quarterly planning sessions. But whenever there is a doubt about whether or not they are measuring the right things.
Let's double click on two pieces of that Venn diagram which are outside of the ideal circle, because I really like the thinking. By the way, thank you, because the way you said it, I used it a few times, but you never actually said how you used it in the past, and this is really good, and I'm gonna steal it.
Please do.
And so those two really interesting areas on that Venn diagram of yours are what we are measuring and we shouldn't. And then even more interesting, what we really should measure, but we don't know how. I'm not saying we can't. Yep. I'm saying we don't know how yet. All right, I'm a little more optimistic on that. So let's start with the first ones. Like, what are the usual metrics you saw that people are measuring because they always have, but they really didn't matter? Were there any commonalities?
Look, I'm struggling to think of one thing that comes up repeatedly, but there's almost invariably one or two or three things that is actually adding no value at all, and it's often a legacy metric that they've just been measuring for years, and they've never really challenged or thought through why they're measuring it. So things like one of my clients used to count how many customers they had below a certain number of dollar revenue a year. So when a customer had a revenue that was below this amount, they would count that. And so my question to them was, well, why do you count this? And they said, a couple of years ago we had a campaign to increase the number of smaller customers. I said, okay, well, have you increased them? Yeah, we have. Yeah, okay. And is that giving you the outcome that you're looking for? And they said, yeah, it is. So how long have you been above the level that you deem to be the right level? And they said, probably about 9 months. Okay, so what purpose is it serving now? You had a specific initiative to increase the number of smaller customers. That's all done. Do you still need to count it? And they said, no, probably not. Okay. You just got your number of company metrics down to a much smaller number. Now, it doesn't mean that someone outside of the leadership team isn't going to count it, but it just meant that they didn't need to bring it up as a company level metric.
Yeah. So I see several types of these not needed metrics. One of them you just talked about, which is okay, we had an initiative in the past and the outcome of that initiative was measured by something. So I'm thinking your typical, very important goal from 4DX, right? Like we improve this from this point
Yep,
to
yep.
that point, right? That's a priority in our language, and it's measured as the numerical outcome of, moving that leading measure. So all good, right? But once you're there, you don't really have to worry about it unless it drops, and that's a different story, right? Like, let's not talk about the blinking red lights when something goes wrong. But again, once you're in that, once you got there, the inertia of attention grabbing another number on the screen, right? That might diminish the importance of the other ones because of the cognitive load just connected to the fact that you have to read the bloody thing is there. So that's one type. The other type, I see are your typical vanity metrics. Just it makes us looking good, and you see that a lot in marketing where, you have metrics that really you can't draw a line between that and any business outcome.
Yep.
So sometimes you see this metric popping in where people really don't know what they should measure, so they put something that it's easy to measure because, whatever platform you're using is showing it in front of you. Any other type you can think of?
No, I think that probably covers most of the ones I see. I mean, I'm quite ruthless in if someone can't explain why they're measuring something and what they're doing about it, if it goes up, down, high, low, or whatever, then they should probably get rid of it. Because if they can't explain what they're using that information for, then it's probably not useful.
Yeah, yeah. I like to look at the metric in several dimensions, and that is, what is the impact? Meaning, can I draw a line between that and the business outcome of some kind? Second is the severity. Like, if this changes a little bit, what is the leverage? Right? Like, if this changes a bit, like, is that a big deal or is it like, yeah, right? Uh, which you have those. And then what is also interesting is the difficulty of measurement. Not that that would necessarily drive your decision whether to measure it or not, but with the we are measuring it and we shouldn't, you very often see relatively easy to measure metrics. And that is a little bit of a red flag that tells you maybe we are only measuring it because we can, not because we should. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because my question, what can you measure, isn't necessarily that it can't be measured. It's that it's really difficult, or it's not consistent, or it's not reliable. So
Or you just don't know how,
if
or
you
you don't have the data, or whatever, right?
that's the obvious one, yeah. But sometimes there are metrics that can be measured, but because it takes so long and because the output is so unreliable or inconsistent, effectively you can't measure it.
Right.
Now, you can get a number, but the number's not real. It's not a real number.
How often did you get into a situation where you were able to, or lead the client? Look, I'm ex-data consultant, right? So I used to live metrics and I had to unlearn so much, when I got into coaching because, somebody's talking, I'm like, oh, you could do that. Uh, right.
Yep, yep,
I
yep.
can't do that anymore. I'm not allowed. So,
Yeah.
but how often do you find like, so why should we measure this? What is the business impact thereof or the meaning? What else can be measured that will answer the same questions?
Hmm. Yeah, because I mean, often there's a way of measuring something in a different way.
Yeah.
And what's springing to mind here is, this concept of leading and lagging indicators, or leading and lagging metrics. Sometimes we measure a lagging metric, whereas a much more useful and much more predictive measure will be something that leads that lagging indicator. So what's going to tell us right now what the likely impact of that lagging indicator is going to be, so that we can take action on it right now rather than in 3 months' time. Because in 3 months' time, it's too late. There's no point in doing something in 3 months' time. The ship has sailed.
Something tomorrow is too
So I
late.
often,
right? It really
Yeah,
depends.
often.
Yeah, it really depends. It really depends on that. We have so much, there are so many lagging numbers when we say, okay, hey, we only had this many billable hours yesterday. Well, the billable hours you didn't do yesterday, you're not gonna get back, right? Like
Yeah,
that capacity, that efficiency is gone. So
yeah,
how do you measure your readiness, your ability to use your time effectively?
mm,
So the billable hours just land where you want them, right? Automatically, and then you just use that to double check, and then you use it for your financial forecasting or whatever, right? But what are the things that are actually moving the needles, not just what
yeah,
shows you how the needle is moving?
yeah. I see a lot of reluctance to use a metric that isn't absolute, which often means that people are reluctant to use leading indicators because they're not. It's not 100% certain that the outcome you're going to get is X. It's probably 80 or 90%, or depending on how good your data is. So I see, particularly within developing leadership teams, because right the way through their careers they've been told this is your number, you've got to hit it. There's a reluctance for them to sort of commit to a leading indicator because it's not absolute. You know, 60 of these things may tell us we've got 30 of those things in 3 months' time, but it could be 35, it could be 25. But what we do know is if we've got two of these things in 3 months, we've probably got none of these things. So it is giving us an idea of what's going to happen in the future. But because it isn't absolute, people are reluctant to say, yeah, we should count that. I'm not sure why people can't make that conceptual leap of this
Yeah,
is going to tell us what's happening in the future. They get there
yeah.
eventually, but particularly in more junior members of leadership teams, all through their career, they've been told, this is your number, this is your number. And that conceptual leap is often difficult to make. But
It might
interested to see if you've seen the same thing.
might be that not really. So I'm like I wouldn't say shocked, but I'm like this is so obvious. Like why would somebody struggle with that? But when you're saying they're used to this is your number, and they're not given the context, they have never seen KFFM. Right? They haven't seen how the number affects potential future numbers further down the stream. There is no tree, because you can easily say, well, in order to have a reasonable confidence that we're going to hit 30 of these things in 3 months, we'll need at least 35 of those things now, right? So once you present it like that, it's like, yeah, of course I need to do 35, otherwise those guys are screwed, right?
Yeah.
That's how that is.
Yeah.
So it might be that they were given the number in isolation without really
Yeah.
understanding the context and why that number is important. I don't know,
Yeah,
just
absolutely. Yeah.
guessing.
Yeah. And why would you commit to a number if that was the case? So, yes, that's probably one of the reasons. Yeah. Hey, Milan, I'm curious. Now, what are your thoughts around slow metrics? So, metrics that don't change very often, but are probably pretty important anyway.
Hmm. Well, I think it's interesting because you quite often run into that in the hard to measure metrics or hard to define
Mm-hmm.
metrics. It's like, why would I be looking at the same number every day? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you have to going back to the idea of the impact and severity, right? What happens when these metrics change and how important that is, right?
Yeah.
And just because it doesn't change every day doesn't mean it can't change any day, because outside effects or something. I'll give you an example. I was working with an engineering team, and engineers are always very interesting. I've run into this a couple of times with several clients in different industries, but once you start talking to engineers about metrics, they're like, we have projects we're running, we have deliveries, like, what do you want us to measure? And eventually we end up with several teams actually on one metrics, and that's a deviation from a plan. Meaning that, hey, we have a plan that we are delivering this particular project, and it will go into production on September 9, right? And now we are at 0, meaning we're good, we're on target, right? So nothing today tells us that we are going to miss that. Or crap, we just got a call from a vendor that their factory burned down, so we are plus 25. That can be, that's huge, right? That could be massive. Or, oh, you know what? We found an easier solution and we are -7, right? So we are creating those things. So when everything goes well and you're within that range, awesome. When it changes, the leadership team needs to know, because there can be a whole cascade of things. So for those metrics, I go down to lights usually. Is it still green? Yeah. So you can process that in milliseconds. You don't have to interpret a number. You're literally just saying, are we good or are we not? Right? And that's it.
Yeah. And I think, one of the limitations of the system we use, Metronome software, is, and I've sort of suggested this as a change to the platform a couple of times, a metric that has an ideal point, but then goes amber or red if it goes too far up or too far down. At the moment, we have to make a choice of, what's bad. If this is a good number, what's a bad number in one direction? I'd love for there to be one that goes red, up or down, depending on an ideal state. I mean, the metric there that springs to mind is just the number of people. If you're counting the number of people because you're a growing business and you need to have certain number of resources in place at a certain time, then a low number is just as bad as a high number. If you've got too many people, then the CFO is going to be knocking on your door saying, "Why have you employed all these people?" Or we're carrying too much of a head count for revenue. Or if you've got a low number, it means that the heads of are not hiring fast enough to get the right capacity in place to deal with the load that's coming down the track.
You know what? I think that you can make an argument that in our world of forecasting and hitting plans, a large number of metrics are like that. Because there is a red flag if there are too many sales coming, because you're going to mess up your delivery, right? Because they're not prepared for that. So I'm all with you. I literally had this conversation yesterday with a friend of mine who used to be in sales. He's an entrepreneur now, so he's getting back to sales, but from the other angle. And he said that he had a problem in his job, and that is that he was so good, right? So he showed up, he got his number. This is your number. And he hit it in 4 months. And it was his annual quota, right? And it was professional services company completely unprepared to deal with that. So besides the fact that, his sales manager screw up majorly by not, putting KFFM in front of him, I think this is a great example, because when we're forecasting an impact of something, there are upper and lower boundaries within which we want to operate. Yeah. And it's not saying that crossing it is bad, but it means it requires attention.
Yeah, something needs to happen. Yeah, there needs action to deal with.
Exactly. And we use this concept elsewhere, right? Like when you're doing reviews, for example, red is not necessarily bad. It just means we need to talk, right?
Yeah, we need focus. Yeah, we need attention. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. But that will be another card, probably in the future.
Indeed, yeah. Milan, it occurs to me that there is one question that we haven't talked about, and just before we wrap this episode up, if it's okay with you, I'll ask the question and answer it, but I'll be curious to see if you have a different answer. So I often get the question, what's the difference between a metric and a target? Now, for me, explaining this as simply as I can, a metric is the thing you are counting. The target is the number you want that thing to be at a particular point in time. End of the quarter, end of the year, end of 3 years. So a target is just a metric with a time frame attached.
Is the desired value, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, precisely. I could use different words, but I would say exactly the same thing. So we won't inconvenience more electrons by doing that.